Yeah, so as Renee mentioned, we're going to be talking about forest carbon markets, specifically for Kentucky woodland owners, but there's some broad information that'll apply to others, even if you're outside of Kentucky, but really kind of focused on this central hardwoods area, central Appalachia. Right, so we know, as Chad mentioned, forests are used for so many things, right? All of these amazing wood products that Chad went through, from musical instruments to furniture to all these nano technologies. They're also really important for ecosystem function, right? And for helping us capture carbon, right? In fact, they've perfected this method of capturing carbon out of the atmosphere and turning that into very useful byproducts that we use as humans. And one of the great things about using forests as opposed to other technologies to try to capture carbon is there's really no construction or no upfront costs to getting into storing and capturing carbon. Right? It uses forestry, which is an established science, industry, and method for managing the land. Right? It offers long-term storage. Right? We talk a lot about forest carbon and the storage in the landscape, but we can also think about carbon storage outside the forest through so many of those amazing products that Chad was talking about, these wood products, that we can actually extend the length of carbon storage from forest sustainable management to sustainable use of our wood products. And there's so many secondary benefits for using forests and thinking about forests as ways to capture and store carbon. And we're going to talk about that and a number of other opportunities, including some that might be beneficial to your pocket books or your bank accounts, right? But let's back up just a little bit. Okay. So we know that there's carbon, and we know that they interact somehow with trees and forests, right? But how they interact is really through this process called photosynthesis, right? Where this carbon dioxide, so the CO2, comes into the plant, into their stomata, to be exact, as well as light. So light radiation coming in from the sun, and water, so HO2 coming up through the roots. And combining these, so the CO2 and the HO2, we go through this photosynthesis process, which creates sugars and oxygen, right? And those sugars are used by the plant to grow, right? To accumulate fiber and to accumulate volume in their forests or in their trees. Right, and then the other byproduct is oxygen, right? And that's a product that is, I don't need to explain how important that is for us. But in that carbon, that's where that carbon is stored. In that sugar, that's where the carbon is stored, right? So we get CO2 from the atmosphere, comes in through photosynthesis to create these sugars and stores the carbon in the tree itself, and it stores it in a number of different locations, right? In fact, most of that storage goes down into the soil, right? That organic matter that the tree is growing in. But specifically in the tree, most of that is in where you would expect it to be, those woody parts of the tree. So the trunk and the branches account for most of the carbon in a tree, and then the roots, and then lastly in the leaves, right? So it doesn't seem like a too abstract of an idea to think about kind of the ranking of this storage of carbon, right? So the wood is number one, long-term storage, decades into centuries and even longer, depending on those wood products, right? And then the roots at the number two, storage for carbon and the tree. And that's can also be extended from decades into centuries. And lastly, the leaves, and those are really a short-term storage, right? Here in Central Appalachia, we look outside, see all the beautiful trees that are turning colors, or the leaves are turning colors and beginning to drop. And that's going through this annual cycle, this annual carbon cycle of growing, storing, decay, releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. So that's really short-term storage. And when we think about the development of forests, not all forests are created equal when we're considering the age and the structure of the forest. So when we have a young forest, this is really when we're thinking about a really rapidly growing forest, lots of competition, so there's higher mortality, trees are competing for resources and sunlight. The smaller trees have limited storage ability, but they are growing really fast. So it is bringing in carbon, right, from the atmosphere. But ultimately, it's rather poor at storage, just because there's not those big branches and trunks that are storing a lot of carbon for a long time. Then we've got that maturing forest, right? This is kind of pretty classical example of most of our forests, or what state they could be in if managed properly. Right? The growth has started to slow down a little bit from those young, rapid, kind of reaching for the sun in competition. And this is best at sequestering carbon. So bringing in carbon. There's some mortality in these forests, as we all know. Trees grow, individual trees might die, or certain disturbances might happen that kill individual trees. And so we do lose some carbon in this process, right? But it's really good at storing. Then when we think about old growth, we actually have very few pockets of old growth here in Central Appalachia, or anywhere in Appalachia. In these old growth forests, there's not a lot of net growth, right? There's a lot of older trees, but also younger trees coming in when given the opportunity to grow, but there's lots of mortality, lots of decay. So it is a carbon sink, and it's good at storing carbon, but it's not necessarily pulling in as much carbon as these more healthy maturing forests. Okay. And also, not all forest types are created equal, right? Similarly to the old growth forests, rainforests are very rapidly growing, but rapidly decaying, and they're not ultimately that great at storing carbon. With the boreal forests, this is kind of on the other end of the spectrum. So it's slow growing, so slow decay, so slow release of carbon back into the atmosphere, but it is good at storing carbon. And then we kind of have this sweet spot, right? This temperate forests where we're at here in Kentucky and central hardwoods, where there's moderate levels of growth, moderate to slow levels of decay, but it's excellent at storing, right? The hardwood trees, the denser trees that store carbon, is really this excellent forest type for thinking about carbon. Right? So just to summarize this forest carbon, so trees are great at sequestering and storing carbon. The forests sequester and store carbon in the trees and in the soil, and we might want to focus on younger and maturing forests if we're thinking about managing specifically for carbon. Right? And again, the temperate forests are key to making an impact globally, at least. Right? So how do we grow carbon? Keeping forests, protecting forest health, encouraging growth, right? So maintaining those healthy forests that are maturing and growing, and sustainable forest management practices. Okay. So this little figure just kind of shows a hypothetical model of carbon storage, right? Where we have trees that are growing their above ground carbon over time. And then we have forest management, right? We might harvest some trees and reduce that amount of above ground carbon. But in doing so, we might accelerate or re-accelerate kind of the capture and storage of that forest, right? So a managed forest potentially has more opportunity to bring in and store more carbon than unmanaged forest, right? And this is important when we talk about forest markets and how we can include forest management in carbon kind of under this same management plan or management philosophy for our own woodlands and forests, right? So that might include some slightly different practices, though, perhaps focusing more on longer rotations. So trying to maintain the growth for longer periods of time before we go in and remove, minimizing soil disruptions, and limiting damage to remaining trees. Right? These all fall in line with this idea of sustainable forest management. Okay, so we've talked about carbon, how it goes from the atmosphere to the tree, how we can manage forests to best utilize carbon, right? And this topic now is really one that is driving a lot of curiosity in landowners and managers. What is it and how might I benefit from carbon, right? And we're just really at the beginning of thinking about carbon storage, at least for smaller landowners, right? So I will preface all of this by saying there's still a lot of uncertainty in the trajectory of carbon in the carbon markets here in the US and in the central hardwoods. But let's talk real quickly about some of those barriers. Okay. A large part of US forests are family-owned forests, and even more so here in Kentucky, where of the forested land that we have, which is 45% or so of the total land coverage, almost 90% of that is owned by family forests, right? So a large chunk of US forests, and particularly here in Kentucky, is family-owned forests. But when we look at the actual markets, right, the registered projects in these carbon markets, almost all of those projects, 98% of those are for large land holdings, right? Not your typical smaller family-owned forest. So you see that darker shading, those are the registered projects. And that lighter shading, that's the actual total acreage of ownerships, where most of it is in smaller land holdings, less than 100 acres. But most of the projects, these carbon markets, are in these larger acreages, right? So it's kind of this discrepancy in the access to these markets, where folks, larger corporations that have more land are also having easier access to these markets. Okay. There are two types of markets: compliance markets, and those are strict markets laid out and regulated by the state. You can think of like California carbon markets. And then there's the voluntary markets. And this is what we're seeing here in Kentucky, in this region. And almost all of these programs are voluntary. Okay. Still, most of these programs are for larger land holdings, okay, 1,000 to 25 acres minimum. Recently, there's been a focus back towards these smaller land holdings. We've looked at those figures that I showed a minute ago, with kind of that disproportionate percentage of carbon markets in these large acreages, right? So there's been a number of efforts to allow more access to smaller land holdings or landowners that have smaller acreages, right? Between 25, 50 acres is fairly common. Okay, so we've got two current options, right? If you've paid attention to carbon markets, you've probably seen NCX, right? The Natural Capital Exchange. And this is one opportunity that's currently available for Kentucky forest landowners, right? This is a timber deferment, right? It's a one-year contract where they use their remotely sensed data and their algorithms and all of their technology to remotely assess the potential that you have in your woodland. So you give them information about where your forest is, some coordinates, and they kind of do a lot of the inspection remotely and will assess kind of your potential for carbon storage and your access to the markets. Right? And there's no guarantee that any landowner will get into these markets. And it's not totally transparent what sort of criteria might limit you from accessing it, but they're looking for landowners that have that potential to store carbon, right? So this is one that a number of folks are asking about, NCX. There's still a lot of unknowns about kind of the long-term impact of actual carbon storage on the landscape. But this is certainly one opportunity that is available to folks in Kentucky. Coming soon is another program, right? The Family Forest Carbon Program. And this is supported by the American Forest Foundation, the Nature Conservancy, and the Audubon, right? The National Audubon Society. And this is really supporting a working woodland. Okay? It understands that there's smaller land ownerships that don't have that access to these carbon markets, but managing a forest is still a very important component to promoting sustainability, removing invasive plants, periodically getting timber revenues from their forests, and those shouldn't exclude someone from entering into a carbon market. And so that's kind of been the goal for this FFCP program. And there's a couple different options, from growing mature forests, so maintaining at least 25% or maintaining at least 75% of your initial basal area, so the amount of the density of your woodland. And there's another program that's promoting regeneration and forest health, like removing competing vegetation and controlling other invasive plants in your forest, right? So those are the two options that we're seeing here, or we're going to see here in Kentucky, right? The NCX is currently available. The FFCP is going to be available in the very near future, right? It's practice-based. Contracts are 20 to 30 years, paid over the course of the contract, and it has a minimum acreage of 30 acres, but it does allow some harvesting, so it encourages active management. Or the other option, NCX, is a deferment, a one-year contract that's paid at the end of the contract, and there's minimum credits, not acres involved. Okay, so what I tell folks, some of these markets in these contracts can be very complex, right? When you're starting to talk about 20 or 30 years of a contract, that should make you pause, right? It should make you think, read all the fine print, and we've joked about needing a lawyer to understand and dissect all these things, but in reality, it's probably not a bad idea to have some legal advice on your woodland, right? This is a valuable asset for you, and if you're going to jump into a big contract, it should be very thoughtful and done with taking a lot of precautions. Okay. Then there's other programs, right? Finite carbon, working woodlands, blue source. These are all larger 2,000 acre plus woodlands. A few other smaller landowner opportunities in core carbon program, forestcarbon.org. Not a lot of information about those. The two that I mentioned, the NCX and the Family Forest Carbon Program, are going to be the two that you're probably going to see the most and have some opportunities to explore as a landowner. Okay, so to end and kind of wrap up and summarize, healthy, sustainably managed forests do retain carbon, right? And its biomass in the wood and the soil, it helps prevent emissions or greater emissions of carbon back into the atmosphere, right? Sustainably managing our forests promotes all sorts of other co-benefits, from clean air to clean water, and a number of other benefits for wildlife and other opportunities such as recreation, right? And by tapping into these markets, you might be able to earn some extra money, right? That's created by the forest while also managing your forests. But there's no right answer and there's no good answer when someone comes to me asking what they should do as a landowner, right? It comes down to your management goals and objectives for your woodland, what you value, and you need to take all these things into consideration. And you can help, and you can talk to a forester about these things. A lot of these things are new topics, but we're talking more and more about them. I would encourage you to be patient as a lot of these things, as we discover more and more about a lot of these opportunities. So a lot of uncertainty, but certainly some opportunity, and we'll be here. And as these things come about, changes in the markets, other opportunities, you can trust that us here at UK Forestry are going to stay on top of that and relay any information that we get onto you, whether you're a county agent, a forester, or a landowner. So I got my contact right there, jacob.muller@uky.edu.